Hello everyone, I am Tom and today we're talking about books. So let's just kick straight into it with the first book, which is Marvel Masterworks, The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1. So this contains the first 10 issues of Spider-Man, as well as little extra bits and pieces in there like concept art and little adverts in between the issues. I think this is something you'd read more as a way to get a glimpse into the origins of Spider-Man and that sort of 60s era of comic books. The stories are all quite simple. I mean, they were primarily written for kids and sort of young teenagers. So if you're going into this expecting some kind of like gripping and complex storylines, then you might be a bit disappointed. But saying that, I did quite enjoy reading this. It has this sort of quaint and nostalgic feeling to it where it's almost like watching 60s episodes of Star Trek or episodes of The Twilight Zone or something. I also think the way the writers were able to sort of capture Peter Parker wanting to be a teenager while also sort of bearing the responsibility of Spider-Man is really well done. I think for the time they really capture that sort of teenage angst, if you know what I mean. Of course that's kind of a staple of Spider-Man, but it was quite interesting reading about a hero who kind of hates being a hero, but he does the right thing anyway because morally he knows that's the right thing to do. There are some pretty funny moments which come from its simplicity and datedness. In one of the first issues, Peter Parker tries to cash a check as Spider-Man, and the guy at the bank just basically calls him a daft bastard because it's like, how you meant to cash a check when you've got a mask on? You know what I mean? And it kind of feels like, well, you've got Peter Parker who can design his own web shooters and can build his own suit, but then he doesn't realise that he won't be able to cash a check without an ID. It's like, come on, man. There's also another issue where it kind of feels like they had a few pages they needed to fill out. So the story is that Spider-Man just goes to the Human Torch to annoy him, and they have a competition on who can impress the most girls, and it's kind of like, God, this is so dated. But yeah, it's a very chilled out read, and it was cool looking into the origins of Spider-Man and that sort of 60s culture. So the next book we're going to talk about is The Chrysalids by John Wyndham. I've read a few John Wyndham books now, and I love his style of almost like British countryside sci-fi. His books kind of feel like they should be read in a cottage in the countryside while you're drinking a cup of tea and there's a fire on the go. I mean, I've never done that personally, but that's kind of the vibe you get from him. But even with that cosy feel, the ideas he writes about are always quite bleak, and they sort of wrestle with that whole human morality thing, but in their own sort of sci-fi way. So this one's set in the post-apocalypse, and due to radiation or something or other, some humans have become mutated or are born with mutations. And mutations can be anything from several eyes or even just an extra toe. And there's also this religious order where anyone who's a mutant is either banished, killed, or they have to run off to a far off place called the Fringes. And then our main character comes into contact with a mutant, and he realises that they're not the hideous monsters that he's been led to believe, and that maybe he himself might have a hidden mutation. So it's that classic story of using a sci-fi idea to confront different prejudices and that sort of fear of an enemy that looks different. The way Wyndham builds this almost medieval world is just fantastic. You really get the sense of how the world has sort of regressed back to something more primitive, almost tribal, and with technology being almost non-existent. You can imagine the sort of run-down countryside village, and there's mud and probably fucking animal shit everywhere, and there's probably like an ominous fog on the hill. It's a bit like what I'd expect Britain to look like after the film Threads. But it also kind of reminded me of Fallout, this sort of post-nuclear war setting, and how different factions and ideas have sort of risen up. It really is a very immersive book, and I've still got a few Wyndham books to get through, and I always enjoy reading how he's going to use a sci-fi idea to explore that sort of themes of, you know, human nature and stuff like that, and all that lovely stuff that he comes out with. So the next one is Airframe by Michael Crichton. This book feels like the novelisation of like a 90s action thriller film that doesn't exist. The plot is interesting enough as it follows like an investigation into a plane crash and, you know, this whole sort of corporate conspiracy. But the characters really feel like placeholders just to tell the story. You could replace the characters' names with the job titles, and I don't think it really would have made any difference. Even our main character comes across as strong, determined, intelligent woman stereotype. I never got the sense of what motivates her. There never seemed to be anything that really made her stand out as a main character. She has a daughter, but she isn't crucial to the plot or anything. And at the start of the book, he's just taken to the cliche deadbeat dad for the rest of the book. You think because a daughter is written into the story that maybe that would give us a bit more insight into what motivates our character. But I don't think it really even would have mattered if the daughter character would have just been taken out completely. That being said, the pacing of the book is fucking lightning fast, and I was hooked to find out what had actually happened to the plane crash. So the story and the writing itself is very engaging, and you just want to know what's going to come next. Even when we're given loads of sort of technical information of how planes are put together, it never felt like it was dragging, and I actually found it quite interesting how the planes were put together. Saying that, I don't know how correct all of it was, but I know from reading Jurassic Park and The Lost World that Crichton can be very technical in his writings, so I wouldn't be surprised if he actually did the research, and a lot of it is somewhat true. Although I don't think I've read the word slats so much until I got to this book. Overall though, it is pretty decent, and it's worth a read in my opinion. I just prefer when you have characters with a bit more character depth and you feel like you're going on the journey with them and not just reading what's happening to them. But yeah, it's pretty decent. Next up is Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk. I think that's how you say it anyway. So this is a miserable book, but I mean that as a positive. It has that angsty, anti-commercialism, anti-capitalism attitude towards it, while also telling us that we can't avoid those things even if we tried. This is the second Chuck Palahniuk book I've read, the first being Fight Club, but this was the first time where I went into one not knowing what the actual story was. Palahniuk reminds me a bit of like an American Irving Welsh, where they both seem to write about grim and taboo subjects, but they address them in such a direct human way, like reading into someone's dark thoughts but with a touch of humour. And to me, they never come across as trying to be edgy or, you know, doing it for shock value. Well, there might be a bit of shock value in there, but I think it's not done just to be, oh, look what I can do, look how fucked up shit I can write about, you know what I mean? The book follows the last living member of a suicide cult and how they become a sort of influential media personality. And it deals with the way how tragedies can be exploited for commercial gain, but also how maybe the systems created, such as work until we're old and frail, has given us purpose, and even if that purpose really is just to benefit the elite, not to get all political or anything, but that's kind of what the book's saying. Our character is lost when he's not told specifically what to do, whether it's from his cult or his social worker or his showbiz agent or even his kind of girlfriend who has dreams of the future, which I feel is meant to reflect how real life can also feel structured by societal expectations. If no one in the real world told us that we had to get a job and we had to find a partner and buy a house and have a kid and all the daft shit that we're supposed to do, would any of us really be bothered to do that unless it was so ingrained in our heads since we were like 2 or something? Sorry, this is getting a bit like philosophical now, but I think that goes in part with what the book is actually trying to say. I did think it got a bit repetitive around the middle, and it felt like the book was just kind of going over the same idea. But just before I started to lose a bit of patience with it, it did sort of kick in again, and I think as a whole, the book really does work. It's a pretty punk rock book, and after reading this and Fight Club, I'm looking forward to reading another Palahniuk book, and hopefully he'll make me hate the world even more. The next book is The Boys from Brazil by Ira Levin. I do love a good sort of 70s thriller detective spy book, And this one's pretty good, but the plot is a bit fucking balmy. I'm going to spoil the sort of main premise, so if you don't want to know anything about this book, then I'd give this one a skip. To put it simply, Joseph Mengele, the Nazi geezer, wants to create a bunch of Hitler clones with the hopes that one of them will grow up and be Hitler 2.0 basically. Now that's a bit of a mad plot in itself, but then when you add in that part of that plan is to recreate the conditions of Hitler's life, it does get a bit convoluted. A part of me thinks that maybe this is more of a satire, as if it's making fun of sort of 70s thriller books and sort of Nazi fiction and taking it to an extreme. Or maybe that could just be how I'm viewing it almost 50 years later. When we find out that the plan is to make a bunch of Hitler clones, it's almost too absurd to think that that's where the book's been leading to. The book even points out how so many things would have to fall into place to recreate the mindset of original Hitler, which is a weird fucking sentence. There's the political and social and economic factors which all led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. You know, it's not just throwing the dickhead out of art school. So it is a bit fucking mad. But all that combined kind of makes me think that the story isn't meant to be taken that seriously. And the underlying message of it is that it doesn't take all this sort of convoluted nonsense to create another Hitler. And I don't mean literally create another Hitler, you know. People will always, you know, use certain social times and different factors to gain control and exploit the masses and, you know, be a fucking dickhead to everyone. The book also asks that sort of classic question of, would you kill baby Hitler? The clones are all around their teens, and it deals with the question of, would they be justified to kill them off if it meant that it would avoid another mass murderer gaining power? So it does have some interesting ideas, despite it being kind of a mad plot. Either way, it is a quite fun read actually, and I enjoyed finding out more of the mystery as the book went along. And I love the use of that sort of real world speculative fiction, mentioning things like the Odessa Project, Nazi human experiments, and of course Joseph Mengele himself, who makes a great villain, which is rather appropriate. His comeuppance towards the end of the book is satisfying as fuck, and it honestly wouldn't feel out of place in a Quentin Tarantino film. Yeah, it's definitely worth a read, I reckon. And I was gripped all the way through, which is what you want from a slightly insane 70s thriller spy book involving Hitler clones. Up next is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. I loved this book. I love the way it was sort of told as a journal, sort of very reminiscent of that sort of classic Gothic literature like Dracula or At the Mountains of Madness, but also had a sort of modern feel to it at the same time. I loved how it really felt like we were going on the journey with our main character. We read from the point of view of an unnamed biologist as she and the rest of her crew man an expedition to a mysterious anomaly on Earth called Area X. The rest of the characters are also only referred to as their job title. But the book manages to humanise our main character, despite her not even being given a name, and instead of her just becoming scientist lady who's telling us what's happening, which is similar to what they did in Airframe. We learn about how her marriage deteriorated before she came to Area X, and it all comes across very natural. It's about two people who initially had a spark despite different personalities, but then them differences lead to a rift and resentment. It helps ground the sort of outside world in reality, contrasting the bizarre nature of Area X. The description of Area X and the sort of strange creatures within it is so brilliant. One standout moment for me was when our characters have to descend down this massive tunnel and you can feel yourself there. The pitch blackness, the never-ending spiral of stairs leading down to the unknown, and the sense that if they kept moving downwards, eventually they'd run into some grotesque creature. It really gets the imagination going. And every new mystery comes in, it really adds the overall world building of Area X until you start to feel like you're a scientist yourself, trying to decipher all the clues of what it could all be about. Some of our questions never get answered, but done in a way that leaves the ambiguity to them up to the reader's interpretation. Honestly, the more I think about this book, the more I just think how good it is. I've got the next two books in the Area X series, and I'm hoping they sort of keep up that moody style with the scientific intrigue and character depth, because I really enjoyed this one. Next one is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Some very interesting ideas in this one. Ideas of government control, free will, and if someone is just born completely evil. We visit this male chick that is Alex, and his journey from violent teenage delinquent to prisoner and then government test subject. What I found most interesting about this book though is how our sympathy goes back and forth for our main character. At first, all we see of Alex is an evil character, going around stealing and assaulting people left and right. But then when he's forced by the government to change against his will, we kind of feel sorry for him that some of his free will is being forcibly taken away. But then we cycle back to, well, he's probably only getting what he deserves. The book also has a very unique use of language, or rather the made up language of Nadsat, which to begin with can be a little confusing, but it's funny as how you read on, you kind of get the gist of it and you're able to read it as if it's just sort of normal words. But I think the use of this sort of made up slang makes us more able to attach ourselves to Alex. We see the world through his eyes, but we also read about it through his language. It's also a kind of strange feeling how we actually feel a bit hopeful for Alex by the end of the book. And it's almost whimsical the way he actually says goodbye to the reader at the end. It's like watching an old friend leave and not knowing when you're going to see them again. But then you're like, oh yeah, this guy's a fucking violent psychopath. So again, the book does a fantastic job of making you feel guilty for liking the main character. I also love how through Alex we get hints of the dystopian world without it being outright explained to us like something from 1984. All we can tell is that crime is uncontrollable and prisons are overcrowded, but the typical government response is of a quick fix rather than addressing the problem head on. It's easier and quicker for the government to force change rather than rehabilitation. But the book also shows the hypocrisy of the other side of the political system. The government uses Alex as a test subject, but then the other side use him to point out the cruelty of the government while also being cruel to Alex themselves. So neither actually care about Alex, and he's merely a political tool. Honestly, this is such a well-crafted book, and being under 150 pages, it really packs so much in there. So if you want like a dystopian fiction which focus solely on one character's experience of it rather than a sort of bigger world system, then I'd definitely give this one a read. The penultimate book for this video is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, and I do have the one which has the artwork from the film that was inspired by it, which is Blade Runner, but I'm just going to talk about the book. And I got this version because, fuck it, it was cheap. I think this book gave me a bit of an existential crisis. Its main theme being a world becoming increasingly artificial through technology. And as life today is starting to feel more like it's being ruled by AI and algorithms, it just makes you want to throw your phone in the ocean and fucking go live in the woods or something. Set in a post-war dying planet Earth, it follows bounty hunter Rick Deckard as he hunts down sentient androids. And while that sounds like the plot of sort of a pulpy science fiction novel, there's so much that the story does that talks about the sort of nature of reality itself. The plot becomes secondary to its overall themes. The hunt for the androids really isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. We're essentially just watching a man going about his job. It's almost like a day in the life story. But within that story lies sort of bigger questions of what it means to actually be human. The juxtaposition of the android's need to be free and them being technically unable to feel empathy, while humans refuse to be empathetic towards the androids and are regimented by routine and material possessions. So it asks the question of which one is the more human, and is being human based solely on the ability to feel certain emotions. You feel yourself going in circles trying to find a reasonable conclusion, and the book doesn't try to tell you what that is. The setting of the book makes everything feel so bleak and depressing. When everything is artificial, even down to emotions being artificially enhanced, it gives off this almost isolating and nihilistic feel to it. You pity the characters and their need for something that's real. Spoiler for the ending here, but I think it sums up the overall message of the book. In this world, owning a real life animal is seen as something as a status symbol. And at the end of the book, Deckard finds a rare, thought to be extinct toad. You feel the happiness it gives him finally possessing something that's real, only to bring it home and find out that it's also artificial. It's genuinely heartbreaking, but his wife, seeing the joy that it gives him, decides to keep it anyway and look after it. And it sort of cycles back to how something artificial can be treated as real if it brings an emotional response. There's a lot to pick apart with this book, which is hard to sort of nail down in a quick 5 to 10 minute review, but it's a story that will stick with you, and I think it deserves sort of sitting down and trying to take it all in. So our last book for today is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This was my favourite book I read this year. Stephen King really has a way of building story and atmosphere, and from the first chapter you already sense the dread of what's to come. This follows the Creed family as they start a new life in Ludlow, Maine, and the secret burial ground nearby, rumoured to resurrect the dead. I love the themes of grief and how death is inevitable, which is a bit morbid, I know, but I love the transition of our main character Lewis, sort of looking at death through his medical lens and how it's a natural and inevitable part of life. And then when he's personally affected by death, all that medical knowledge goes out the window and he acts completely on pure grief and emotion. But a part of you can somewhat relate to his sort of rash and insane decisions, because you can't help ask yourself, if you could bring someone back, would you? The story also has some of King's sort of classic paranormal horror tropes, which really add to the creepiness and dread of it all. I can't believe this book actually made me kind of creeped out by an undead cat. It has a really unique take of something being undead. The description of the resurrected just really gets your mind going. They're not exactly mindless zombies, but they're not like vampires either. This is kind of a oxymoron, but they're almost living dead. The way they're described as smelling of damp soil, it's almost like you can smell it as you're reading. You can just imagine the smell of a grave following them around. It's fantastic. There's something about this book where you feel the presence of death hanging over everything. The book does allude to there being an evil force from the burial ground, and you could read the book as something more literal. In a similar way, you could read The Shining and just view it as a haunted hotel story. But I think what makes this stand out from something like The Shining is that death is something we all will experience, from losing someone close to us or until we eventually die ourselves. I think that's what makes this book so brilliant and makes it so creepy and bleak, but almost fascinating at the same time. Yeah, I really love this one. I go back and forth on Stephen King sometimes. I feel he can be a bit maybe melodramatic, and he has a tendency to sometimes over-explain things. And I'm not saying this book doesn't have a bit of that, but when he mixes it all together, he proves why he's a master of writing. And I'm looking forward to another Stephen King book at some point. So that'll do it for this video, and thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I might do some more book videos throughout the year. I'm currently reading The Orchid Keeper by Cormac McCarthy, which is pretty decent, but we'll see how it goes. If you've got any recommendations for books, then just let me know, because I'm always up for it. And yeah, take care of yourself, and I'll see you again.